No, it is a somewhat daunting task, but I actually believe young people in particular are intrinsically hopeful, intrinsically optimistic, intrinsically have a vision for how to lead a better life. And so the question is, how do we best tap into that inner drive, that inner motivation that young people already have?
Ian Rowe, it's such a joy to talk to you. And I'll tell everyone why. It's because I heard you speak at the recent ARC conference in London. And as soon as I heard you, I thought, this man is on to something. Because one of the issues we've got in the UK, and I know you've got in the US too, is this issue, not only the importance of marriage, right, which I think everyone realizes now is really important. And whether they're willing to admit that and talk about that is a whole other conversation, right? They realize it's important, but the idea that many of our young people, the building blocks that psychologically lead to something like marriage have been systematically removed from their personalities. And that's a real fundamental problem that we need to recognize and address in society. And when I heard you, I thought, yeah, this guy is a very important piece of the puzzle because you've recognized that and you're doing something to put them back in place. And that's why it's so great to talk to you. Our listeners should realize that although your accent will not give it away, you are in fact a Londoner from
Yes,
London.
I was born in
So
Islington.
yeah, so introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you. Tell us about the Vertex Academy, and your background, etc., and what you're doing at the moment, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, so Tony, it's such a pleasure to see you, and I'm inspired that you had an opportunity to hear my remarks at ARC. It was quite an honor to present, and in fact to present on this subject of how we cultivate within our society in America, in Great Britain, throughout the West, a sense that young people really can have a sense of personal agency, that they can lead self-determined lives of meaning and purpose. And for many of us who have been able to embark upon the life of our own choosing, a lot of that had to do with our ability to form a strong family, even if the family in which we came from may have had its challenges, but somewhere along the way we recognized that I can break a cycle of dysfunction if that's what I had experienced. And many of the things that I talk about, I mean, I run schools in the Bronx, New York, and I run schools in communities where the non-marital birth rate is nearly 9 in 10, where nearly 9 in 10 babies that are born outside of marriage. And I unfortunately see a lot of the challenges that emanate from that beginning. Now, it's always important to say that simply because a child is born in a single parent family or some other structure, that doesn't necessarily mean that their life is guaranteed to be a failure, nor does it mean if a child is born into a married
Mm.
two-parent household, is it a guarantee that that will be a success? But the data is overwhelming that the best environment, the most likely environment for a child to have positive outcomes is to be married into a two-parent household. And so I spent a lot of time in our schools teaching our kids about virtues, about academics, rigorous academics. But we also talk about the importance of family formation. And my personal story is that I'm the child of Jamaican immigrants that first went to England. My dad, at the time, Jamaica was an English Commonwealth. And so my dad went to England after starting to date my mom. And when he got to England, he wrote for her hand in marriage. So she took a boat all by herself at 19 years old, took 5,000 to come to England to get married, and they started this life together. They started this great adventure. It's another reason we talk about marriage, healthy marriage, because a life partner can, join you on the great adventure of life. My parents were married for 48 years before my dad passed away. So we can talk about these things in more detail, but strong marriages are the foundation for a healthy life and a healthy society.
Mm. And it's interesting because part of your talk, in ARC, you spoke about social mobility. And but people who don't know what that means, it means that, look, just because you're born in a poor, deprived background doesn't mean you have to stay there. And that some analysis had been done in the US, who just have so much rich data to play with. But anyway, they'd looked at, over a period of time, the states in which most people had gone from poverty to middle income, higher income brackets. And they then kind of evaluated, well, in those states where that happens quite a lot, what are the factors? And the factors that popped out, the correlative factors that popped out very vibrantly, number one was a higher number of people growing up in biological parents, married parent homes, if you like. The second one was the idea of being part of a faith community, whatever that was. And so they kind of learned good things and bad things. And then the third thing was education. Mm-hmm. And they'd gone to a school that kind of endorsed those values. And you and your principles have added to that the idea of entrepreneurship. So it kind of, you come up with the acronym FREE. Yes. And you talk about how really you're taking these kids who are born in deprivation and you're saying, look, it doesn't have to be these. These are the success factors. If you want them, go for them. And what strikes me is in your schools, to get there, you've got some pillars, which are profound. Do you want to tell us about those pillars?
Yes. So, well, first of all, Tony, thank you for relating that, because I do think it's important oftentimes when we come to these conversations around marriage and family, there are those who think it's a completely ideological, you're just moralizing. And to some degree, that is true. I mean, I do believe that there is strong value in marriage. However, for some, what they need to really hear is the evidence, is the data. I think there's a overwhelming data, and I did cite a study that had been done at Opportunity Insights, which is run by Raj Chetty out of Harvard. It's very hard to deny these outcomes, because they looked at 40 million tax records. Every single child born in the United States between 1980 and 1982, they looked at the income where their families were along an economic spectrum, and then they looked at those same individuals 30 years later. And the analysis was, if you were born in the lowest economic quintile, right, the bottom 20%, but 30 years later, you were earning in the top economic quintile, right? What were the factors that drove that change? And that is very powerful evidence. And as you just laid out, the researchers said that the number one factor was at the neighborhood level was the concentration of married two-parent households.
Yep.
And what's interesting about that is that not only is it drives economic mobility to be in a home, your own home, in married two-parent households, but even if you're not, but you're in a community that has a concentration of married two-parent households, that also helps drive upward mobility. And that makes sense, right? Because you think about baseball coaches or cricket coaches in England, that you see that religious faith and as you said, access to quality K-12 education. So these are factors that really matter. And we've said this is information that our students really need. So we teach information like the success sequence. So, for example, there's data that says if a young person finishes just a high school degree, then a full-time job of any kind, so they learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if they have children, if they get married first, young people who follow that series of decisions, education, work, marriage, then children, in that order, 97% avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. So for us, that is just incredibly compelling. And yet, even that, we recognized as a school, we also have to help our students develop a moral framework for decision making. And so that's why we've organized our school around four cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom.
And those, Ian, before you get onto this, because I think I want to spend some time really exploring what they mean and how there's a complete lack of them in the education system these days. But before we get there, I mean, you've raised a very interesting kind of thought, because so in the UK, I often mention this statistic that 90% of the richest mothers are married, only 20% of the poorest mums are married. Yep. So in terms of the the social mobility leg up, the rocket boosters that you're talking about, well, the poor people don't have them, the rich people do, and the divide gets bigger and bigger. Yet the problem is, and we know this, right? So our organization, I may be a Christian, but we approach it from a secular evidence base, and we know this, it's unequivocal. Yet, Ian, I go up and down the country, I talk to thousands of our supporters, many of whom are teachers, and they will say, we're told not to talk about marriage and long-term relationships, because it offends people.
Yes.
We're told to talk about and magnify the other models of lifestyle.
Yes.
And you're thinking, it clearly makes no sense for children.
Right.
For the sake of avoiding potentially offending a tiny minority, we dissuade the massive majority from the thing which will bring them the most positive outcomes in life. What on earth are we doing, Ian? Where's it coming from?
Yeah, the hypocrisy is dripping because, in fact, it's not offending. The people that it's offending are the very people who are getting married and who are following those norms in their own lives. But somehow they feel that they're imposing their middle class values on so-called people who are marginalized and disadvantaged. In my own work, when I've heard that narrative, we thought, wow, are we doing something? Or by teaching, for example, the success sequence or the benefits of marriage or
Yeah.
sequence of decision making, education, work, marriage, and children, are we somehow being offensive to our parents? Because it is true, the vast majority of the students in our schools, their parents did not follow the success sequence. Their parents did not get married generally. So we asked them, we went to our parents and we said, you've chosen our school because of the rigorous academics and the international baccalaureate program and the apprenticeships that we model, that we offer in different industries. But we also are going to teach your kids about decision making and the kinds of decisions that are likely related to long-term success. And one of those pieces of information will be this data around the success sequence, that 97% of young people avoid poverty when they make these decisions in this order. Feedback that we got from our parents who hadn't made these decisions in their own lives, they said, thank God someone is teaching my children these things, because I wish that someone had taught to me growing up. So these people who are saying you can't do this because it's expensive, they're the gatekeepers that are hypocritically withholding this information from the very young people that need it, while simultaneously making these decisions in their own lives and telling their own children there are better ways to enter young adulthood. So that was a big lesson that I learned, that you have to ignore the gatekeepers. We know what works. In the Black community in the United States, for as long as economic data has been kept, the poverty rate for Black married couples has been in the single digits for decades, as compared to 30-40% in all other family structures.
Yeah.
It's
Wow.
it's
That's incredible, isn't it? That's incredible.
it's irrefutable. And so the reason I think data is so important is that there is this kind of moral um, rejection or resistance. You're evangelizing, you're moralizing, you're trying to, you're making moral judgments. And the thing is, again, to some degree, I do believe marriage is a moral question. I think it's connected to human flourishing, life happiness. But for those people who really need to see an objective case, that objective case is there.
And it's just staggering how obvious that is. And we're happy to talk about the benefits of physical exercise. We're happy to talk about what you eat and the importance of those things. But then this stuff which is perhaps statistically even more important, in terms of life outcomes and the sorts of things that if it were a pill, it would be the most wonderful pill in the world in terms of what it delivers, but it's not. It's cheaper than a pill.
Well, what I've discovered is that for some people who don't want to talk about the importance of marriage, and by the way, of course, we're talking about healthy marriages, we're not talking about situations in which you have domestic violence. So let's just note that. But for those people who are uncomfortable talking about the importance of marriage, healthy marriages, and the importance
Yeah.
of family structure, they have another reason that they don't want to talk about it. And that's because they have built a narrative of systemic oppression, institutional discrimination, structural bias around issues of race or gender. And so, if you allow another set of explanations for why more young people aren't successful, and you start to say, well, family structure is a factor that is what I call transcendent, crosses race, it crosses class, it crosses gender, then these folks have to abandon the narrative that they've built their entire uh, rationale on. And so that's something for anyone interested in this conversation, you have to realize that's part of the opposition. If you believe that you see a disparity, let's say, for example, you see a disparity in race in terms of educational outcomes or poverty outcomes, and you see a racial disparity, you'll say, well, there it is. That racial disparity must be due to racism. End of story.
And
But
this is back to your thing about trying to train young children not to be victims,
100%.
self-imposed victimhood, but to actually recognize they've got agency. The past does not equal the future, and there are
Correct.
things and ways you can go which will make the likelihood of successful outcomes much more reasonable for you. And here are those things, and then that choice is up to you. And brilliantly to get them there, your pillars. I want to get onto your pillars because they're fantastic. Because again, it's back to, we can tell kids about marriage, blah blah blah, but there seems to be so much missing from their psyche these days. And your four pillars builds those character building blocks back into them. So then something like marriage doesn't seem like such an unreasonable prospect when they so tell us about these wonderful pillars that you've got.
Yeah, so I run schools. I run Vertex Partnership Academies, which is an international baccalaureate high school in the community, the Soundview section of the Bronx. And if you're running a school, that means you have children 8 to 10 hours a day, sometimes the weekends, after school. Whether you like it or not, you are in the moral formation business, right? So even if you choose not to be deliberate about it, you're still in the moral formation business. You're just leaving a void that is going to be filled by forces that are probably not aligned with what you're seeking to achieve. So he said, let's be explicit. Let's make the implicit explicit. Let's be clear about the virtues and values that we want to have our students be immersed within. And the question is, okay, well, then what values and virtues? And it's like, well, we don't have to create something from whole cloth. There's something called the cardinal virtues, which have been around for eons, right? And these cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. In fact, even the word cardinal comes from the Latin root cardo, which means hinge, right? So all other standards of moral excellence depend upon these four virtues. So resilience, determination, optimism, gratitude, perseverance, all of those character-based strengths emanate from courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And what we decided to do was not only have those as just the four virtues, but we put what we call I statements together. So, for example, courage is I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle, right? Or temperance. I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. So I want all of your listeners to sort of project themselves thousands of miles away to the Bronx and think about our students, many of whom are from low-income communities where lots of people are telling them all of the things that they cannot do. Together, they stand in unison, saying, I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. So we use those virtues as a very powerful mechanism to help our students realize what they do have in their quiver, what they do have in their locus of control. And that's how we certainly seek to cultivate agency within our students.
Yeah, and how so on a day-to-day basis? I mean, you've got this wonderful thing in the US where people stand up and say things at the beginning of school and the beginning of a class, and which is like, try that in the UK if you dare. But it's like it is a really good thing because actually, who was it said? It's gone from me, but some philosopher talking about, give me a nation and its songs and I will give you its victory or its defeat, because we believe what we repeatedly say to ourselves and those
Yes.
sorts of things. So it's really important to kind of say those sorts of things. And even, if you've ever read things like Thinking Fast and Slow, we know, and good schools know, that just putting positive words up around the classroom or in life in a building has a positive impact, an impact more so than putting negative words around. And we know this. So saying these things, is, but what else is it embedded in the school in any other way than just saying these things in the morning?
Well, oh no, no, no. It's throughout. It's the literature that we choose, and so we'll have our language and literature class is organized around the virtues. We'll choose texts that have characters that embody these values. We do a lot of oral recitation of poetry, poems like Invictus. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
I know it well. Yeah.
Interesting. So, and it's not enough just for students to memorize these words and kind of think it in their head. No, there's something very important about the social experience around everyone standing up together, and our students are in blazers or tie. It's a very beautiful look. But when everyone stands up together in unison, saying these words, it goes far beyond just thinking it in your head. It's as if it's a collective commitment to each other and how are we going to operate as a community.
And it becomes a credo for interactivity within the school as well. Which we both know Catherine Birbalsingh, and it's a similar sort of thing in her school over here in the UK. That people hold each other to account based on these principles that they're looking at, and it becomes a lifestyle. And you think, yes,
It's a lifestyle, it's
got
a
it.
common language, and
Yeah,
it's part of who we are as a
yeah,
community. And so the reason I think it's so important to run schools is that again, you have an external community that is constantly preaching one narrative of learned helplessness. And so it's really important. So whether it's Catherine, the Michaela School in Wembley, or Vertex Partnership Academies in the Bronx, we want to have a living example. What is possible when you create the conditions where agency, self-determination, taking responsibility, we can see it. And so it's not just a theory. And so between the living example that someone can come visit and touch and feel and speak to our students, as well as this overwhelming evidence, that's what we think together can hopefully turn the tide against this narrative of victimhood.
which is marvelous. And it's like there's a lot of scratching of chins and rubbing of heads, thinking about what's going on in the UK, how do we get things back, etc., whatever that even means. And we recognise that the success or failure of our country is not going to be determined by our parliament, for example, but by our schools.
Yes.
Because they are the future. They are the future leaders. They are the future country.
Yes.
And that's where the struggle really is. But if you look at the bigger system, it's heading in a very different direction these days in the US and in the UK. And so, I don't know, advice. I mean, you've been able to set up the wonderful academy and you've been able to find the funding, which is great. But is that a scalable model? I mean, in the UK, probably not. So any advice, any thoughts on what and how we retrieve the prosperity, the future outlook of our young people to give them the kind of hope they need, take their mentality away from victimhood and self-identity and self-importance into what they can be through what they become and what they give and what they are and what they do in the future, as opposed to what they've been in the past or what they are now.
No, it is a somewhat daunting task, but I actually believe young people in particular are intrinsically hopeful, intrinsically optimistic, intrinsically have a vision for how to lead a better life. And so the question is, how do we best tap into that inner drive, that inner motivation that young people already have? And as someone who runs schools, as well as I work in the policy arena, so I think two things can happen at the same time. One is we need more examples of great leaders, such as Catherine Birbalsingh, hopefully someone like me, and others, that we're not the only two in the world. There are other schools that have the same ethos.
There are, yeah. There are other good head teachers. I know some myself. There are other very
Exactly,
good ones.
exactly.
Yeah.
And there's an explosion in classical education, certainly in the United States. There are many, many more. One of the positive outgrowths of the COVID fiasco over the last few years, certainly in the United States, is that there are now more and more examples of parents being given the power to choose a great school for their child. If you harken back to the study mentioned, remember there were three factors: concentration of married to parent households, concentration of religious faith, and access to high quality K-12 schools. So in the United States, there actually is something very positive happening, and maybe this could be replicated um, in Great Britain, which is more and more educational leaders that want to lead virtues-based schools with high academics that talk about the importance of family. Because that's what's happening here in the United States. And unfortunately, it's come out of decades of incredibly dismal results.
Mm, mm,
But
mm.
maybe this is, it's darkest before it's darkest before the dawn.
Maybe so. Maybe, and I know one or two good heads who are working in the state, the public school system, and they've said, well, no, we're going to try something different because we think the kids are worth it, And lo and behold, like you say, the parents are actually on their side, because that's a really good idea. And the whole point of maybe an interview like this is that maybe some teachers or some heads will listen and think, yeah, maybe I should be doing that after all. And if they want to get in touch with you, Ian, how would people get hold of you?
Oh, I'm very easy to reach on the internet. So I'll even give you my email address. It's in.row at vertexacademies.org, or I'm actually a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So there it's ian.row at aei.org. I also have written a book called Agency that fleshes out this entire philosophy and the framework: free, family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. I'm excited to speak to anyone who has a desire to create the kinds of environments where young people understand factors that lead to human flourishing.
And I think that that's such an important point to maybe end on, the idea that we can't wait for the whole system to change. We can't wait for the state. Turns out we can't even wait for the church. To paraphrase one of your earlier presidents, we're the people we've been waiting for. You want the ones and twos to pick it up and to start going and to speak to people like you and other people who are doing it and saying, do you mind if I take that blueprint and give it a go in my place? Go for it, and I'll tell you what lessons we've learned, and one by one we can make a difference. Ian Rowe, you're a breath of fresh air, an absolute inspiration. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Tony, thank you for having me on.